Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents America Last, the Right's century-long romance with foreign dictators, by Jacob Heilbrunn, narrated by Kent Klineman. The tender respect of Augustus for a free constitution which he had destroyed can only be explained by an attentive consideration of the character of that subtle tyrant. Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Introduction. When the Heritage Foundation celebrated its 50th anniversary in April 2023 with a two-day conference and lavish party at Mount Vernon, it invited a number of leading conservative politicians, including Senators Tim Scott, J.D. Vance, Mike Lee, Rick Scott, and Josh Hawley, as well as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who had not yet announced his bid for the presidency. But one guest speaker's name stuck out on the program, that of Balázs Orbán, a 38-year-old Hungarian parliamentarian and political director for Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. They are not related. Balázs Orbán spoke right after Vance, who decried Ukraine as the most corrupt government in the world. Get America out of Ukraine. Hostility to Ukraine and respect for Russian President Vladimir Putin as a foe of woke Western liberalism are widespread on the right. At the same time, Hungary's government enjoys considerable favor for its crusade on behalf of traditional family values, its crackdown on liberal institutions, and its simple hatred for migrants. Orbán was appearing as part of a panel, Strengthening Our Cultural Institutions, that discussed transgender rights, among other things. A man is a man, and a woman is a woman, Orbán said. It's in the Constitution. End of discussion. He meant, of course, the Hungarian Constitution, which Orbán's Fidesz party modified in March 2014 to weaken the country's democracy. With his allusions to Renaissance paintings, French novelists, and the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the bespectacled Orbán gave off an academic air, but he delivered a dispatch from the front lines of the culture wars in Hungary, which has created an illiberal democracy. Orbán received an ecstatic response for his comments about so-called gender ideology, seeming to elicit not only rapt attention, but also a degree of envy from his fellow panelists and the audience alike. No Hungarian official has worked more assiduously to forge ties with a variety of conservative organizations and the Republican Party than Balázs Orbán. While Viktor Orbán swoops in for high-profile addresses to the Conservative Political Action Conference, it's the younger man who engages most frequently with the American right. American government officials in Hungary call him the puppet master. His time in America was not limited to the Heritage Conference. Orbán was everywhere, flogging his book, The Hungarian Way of Strategy, in a meeting with the New York Young Republican Club, appearing on Tucker Carlson Tonight, and meeting Vance at his office in the Dirksen building for a photo op. He tweeted a resulting picture with the words, "Thank you for being a good friend of #Hungary and for standing up for our shared values." Back home, where his visit was widely reported on in state media, Orbán's high-profile itinerary was touted as affirmation of the prominent place that Hungary occupies on the American political landscape. One heritage official excitedly told me, "I'm definitely going to make the pilgrimage to Budapest." During the panel discussion, Orbán was treated like a visiting dignitary by the moderator, Delano Squires, a research fellow at the Foundation's Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family. Like a talk show host soliciting advice from a self-help guru, Squires was palpably eager to learn what lessons Orbán could convey from his battles to defend Western civilization. And Orbán seemed happy to oblige. After joking that he has the same scary last name as Viktor Orbán, Balázs lauded the cooperation between Hungary and heritage. He explained that Hungary had become a conservative safe space where traditional family values were strictly observed. Hungary, he claimed, had slashed abortion and divorce rates in half, an essential component of its efforts in a geopolitical competition with non-Western nations that are outstripping the West in birth rates. To safeguard your national identity, he said, you could surrender by allowing in vast numbers of migrants, or you could adopt pro-natalist policies, including financial incentives and property subsidies. He didn't have to add which course he recommended for America. Why were the America Firsters at the Heritage Foundation, the think tank that is the crown jewel of the conservative movement, looking to a Hungarian parliamentarian as a guide to navigating the culture wars? How had a small, landlocked country with half the population of Florida and dependent on economic subsidies from Brussels emerged as a model for the proud American right, those supposed believers in American exceptionalism? How, in short, did Hungary become the future that works for this country's conservatives? Over the past decade or so, I've had numerous opportunities to observe the conservative fascination with foreign autocrats firsthand. As editor of The National Interest, a magazine that was founded by the neoconservative godfather Irving Kristol, and that published Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, I have come into contact with a wide variety of figures on the right, a number of whom ended up in Donald Trump's orbit. After graduating from Oberlin College, I became an assistant editor at the magazine in 1989, the year the Eastern Bloc crumbled, before attending graduate school at Georgetown University. As an editor at the New Republic, I coined the term theocon in a cover story in 1996 about intellectual radicals on the right. After writing a book about neoconservatism and the Iraq War, I ended up returning in 2008 to The National Interest, which Kristol had sold in the interim to the Canadian media mogul Conrad Black and the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom in 2001. In 2007, Black was convicted of mail fraud and obstruction of justice. In May 2019, President Trump granted Black, the author of Donald J. Trump, A President Like No Other, 2018, a full pardon. Black ceded full control of the magazine to the Nixon Center's president and CEO, Dimitri K. Simes. Simes was a controversial figure in Washington, a hulking man who had emigrated from Russia to the United States in January 1973 as a 26-year-old. He had worked as a researcher for Yevgeny Primakov, who became Russia's prime minister at the Communist Party's most influential think tank, the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, where he also served as acting secretary for the Institute's Komsomol, or Communist Youth League, branch. His mother, Dina Kaminskaya, was a defense attorney, or advocate, in Moscow, who represented Soviet dissidents such as Yuli Daniel and Vladimir Bukovsky. Her husband, Konstantin Simis, was an expert on Soviet constitutional law. They were expelled from the Soviet Union in 1977. "It's not a story of immigration," Simis told the Washington Post. "It's a story of exile. We did not want to leave our country." In 1982, Kamenskaya published a memoir, Final Judgment, My Life as a Soviet Defense Attorney. Simis wrote a book titled USSR, The Corrupt Society, that appeared the same year. My intention was to prepare an encyclopedia of Soviet society and state at all levels, from streetwalkers to Politburo members, he said. The corruption of the ruling machine corrupts the people too. While his courageous parents worked to expose the true nature of the Soviet system, Symes followed a different tack. He called for détente with the evil empire. In 1979, Symes published an essay in Foreign Policy that raised eyebrows around Washington, particularly among the neoconservatives who became his lifelong enemies. It was called the Anti-Soviet Brigade. Symes complained that unrepentant Cold Warriors were peddling half-truths and lies about Soviet behavior at home and abroad, and that Washington was moving away from accepting Moscow as a legitimate equal in world affairs. Instead, what was needed when it came to the Kremlin was dialogue. Symes would make the same argument decade after decade. Russian regime after Russian regime. Whether Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, or Putin were in charge, his counsel remained steadfast. America should cater to the Kremlin's sensitivities. By September 2018, he was ensconced in Moscow as the host of a television show on Russian state television Channel 1 about foreign affairs called Bolshaya Igra, the Big Game. After Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a historic appearance before the U.S. Congress on December 21, 2022, Symes went on the Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovyov's radio show, Full Contact, to denounce him. As I watched the TV coverage, Symes said, I also thought of comparisons to Churchill, not of Zelensky, but Putin. This was a speech worthy of Churchill, the speech of President Vladimir Putin. His remarks did not go unnoticed. In January 2023, Adrian Karatnicki, a former president of Freedom House, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that dubbed Symes one of Putin's American cheerleaders. In June 2023, Symes moderated a plenary session at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum with Putin and his Algerian counterpart, Abdelmajid Tebboune, prompting one observer to tell the Moscow Times that his job there is to play the role of the model American, to show viewers that there is another, normal America. So he's been thanked and promoted to the honorary role of moderator. Symes initially rose to prominence as director of the Soviet and East European Research Center at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. In 1983, he joined the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as a senior associate. In an August 1984 op-ed, he alluded to Nixon's missteps during Watergate, but summed him up as not only a very impressive president, but also in an important way an honorable statesman. He met the former president for the first time in 1985 at his office in Lower Manhattan and went on to become his post-presidential advisor on Russian affairs. Nixon had a long-standing fascination with Russia, dating back to his first visit in July 1959 as Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president, when he conducted the famous kitchen cabinet debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the American National Exhibition in Moscow's Sokolniki Park. After Nixon died in 1994, Symes became the president of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom, a position he occupied until 2022. In 1998, it changed its name to the Nixon Center. Then in 2011, the Center for the National Interest. Throughout, Symes boasted what were surely the most intimate ties of any American private citizen to the Kremlin. The extensive nature of those ties started to become apparent to me when I encountered a young red-headed woman named Maria Butina at a small Center for the National Interest event. A Russian exchange student at American University, Butina was connected to Alexander Torshin, the rubicund former deputy governor of Russia's central bank, and she was later arrested by the Justice Department as an unregistered foreign agent. On June 8, 2015, Symes emailed her to relate that, "I will mention to him that he may get a piece from you." Him was me. Later that day, Butina sent me an op-ed she had drafted about how the Russian bear and the American elephant could cooperate in the interests of world peace. Her main thrust was that American conservatives should stop demonizing poor, misunderstood Putin. It was time for an alliance between the Russian and American right. I was bemused, emailing her that I looked forward to publishing the audacious essay. It seemed far-fetched, to say the least. That conservative Republicans would cozy up to Putin? No way. With Trump's candidacy for the presidency, however, the very scenario that had seemed so improbable to me increasingly began to resemble reality. In early 2016, shortly before the start of the Republican primaries, Symes summoned me to his office. "Guess who I've just been talking to?" he bragged. "Donald Trump, the next president of the United States." A lunch meeting with Henry Kissinger followed that spring in the boardroom of the Time Warner Center in New York. Jared Kushner, in his trademark dark suit, white shirt, no tie, and white tennis shoes, took part. The subject was artificial intelligence. I vividly recall the look of astonishment on Kushner's otherwise impassive face after the meeting adjourned, and Symes made a beeline for him, announcing that he viewed Trump favorably. "You do?" Kushner said. Kushner may have been incredulous, but the bond was forged. In coming months, Symes bragged to me that he was speaking regularly with Trump, though he was careful to note that it wasn't anything like discussing foreign affairs with Nixon. After protracted negotiations with the Trump campaign, Symes hosted Trump's sole foreign policy speech during the primaries at the Mayflower Hotel in April 2016. A day or so before the speech, Symes came into my office and sat down on the white leather couch opposite my desk. He explained, really decreed, that the magazine would be the speech's sponsor so that it could pass muster as a press event. At the private reception before the speech, where everyone from Senator Jeff Sessions to the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, was circulating, Trump bounded in and exclaimed, "Hello, everybody!" His sole criterion for interest in a particular person was celebrity. "You're famous!" he shouted when former Reagan National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane shook his hand. By contrast, I received a quizzical stare. Soon enough, it was time for the speech itself in the Mayflower Ballroom. After announcing to the audience that Trump would appear shortly, I took my seat behind that of his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and watched from up close as the future president clutched the lectern in a death grip, bellowing about America first. Trump didn't make any rhetorical bows to the foreign policy establishment. Quite the contrary, like Senator Joe McCarthy condemning the State Department's traitorous, bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouths at Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, Trump sneered at the so-called foreign policy experts with their perfect resumes who had nothing to brag about. That evening, I wrote a piece for Politico that enraged the Trump campaign. It was subtitled, "After his son-in-law contacted us, we decided to give him a chance to deliver, at last, a coherent view of the world. I wasn't converted." When Trump won the presidency in November 2016, I thought of the credo of Saul Bellow's protagonist, Moses Herzog. If I am out of my mind, it's all right with me. Robert Mueller, after he was brought on as special counsel in May 2017 to investigate Russian interference in the election, took a long look at the Center for the National Interests hosting of the Trump speech. He was eager to learn what, if any, contact had taken place between Kislyak and Sessions, who became Trump's first Attorney General. Like a number of others affiliated with the center, I testified before the commission. In the end, the Mueller report found that Symes and the center had extensive contacts with the Trump campaign, but that no wrongdoing occurred. Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin summed up the mess in a column titled, "Dimitri Symes Flew Too Close to Trump, and His Think Tank Got Burned." There was no question that things had changed in Washington. Where the neocons had once counseled intervention everywhere, the new advance guard was declaring that it should take place nowhere. It was Trump's bargain basement version of foreign policy realism. America's allies are moochers. We have no national interest in maintaining alliances in Asia or Europe. Ukraine belongs to Putin's sphere of influence. Dictators are worthy of emulation, and so on. That was turning into the new foreign policy gospel, at least in Republican circles. As Washington descended into a moronic inferno, something unprecedented was taking shape. Or was it? The longer I've listened to conservatives today talk about Hungary, Russia, wokeness, the deep state, abortion, immigration, and media bias, the more I've become convinced that many of their arguments are not novel. If anything, the opposite is true. These arguments represent an act of conservation, preserving in a kind of rhetorical alembic grievances and apprehensions that can be traced all the way back to World War I, when intellectuals on the right displayed an unease with mass democracy that manifested itself in a hankering for authoritarian leaders abroad. In the 1920s and 1930s, this set of beliefs, or habit of mind, became even more pronounced as Hitler and Mussolini attracted a variety of American devotees, including the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst and the aviator Charles Lindbergh, as well as outright fascists such as the publicist Lawrence J. Dennis and the New York financier Merwin K. Hart. Throughout the Cold War, the right evinced a fondness for autocrats such as Francisco Franco and Augusto Pinochet, even as some wrote revisionist accounts of the Third Reich, which wasn't so bad, after all. Today, a Hungarian strongman who is peddling Volkisch ethno-national thought as a replacement pan-European ideology, the pretense being that the unelected bureaucrats running the European Union have supplanted the Soviet Union as the threatening totalitarian power, is the latest object of the right's dictator worship. Balázs Orbán has traveled to the U.S. to make his pitch and to forge connections, But American politicians and intellectuals and talk show hosts also now flock to Budapest to celebrate and emulate his boss. The contemporary left might look to the Nordic social democracies for policy inspiration, but it engages in nothing as coordinated or systematic as the right's polemics on behalf of Orbán and other authoritarians. Its aims are expansive. Liberalism, conservatives say, stands for totalitarianism, democracy for injustice, and rights for decadence. Conservatives have a different formula. They wish to protect freedom in the name of limiting it. They aspire to create a revolution to preserve tradition, to capture the future by returning to a mythical past. Right-wing intellectuals profess to subscribe to foreign policy realism, which they argue means allying with warmongers abroad in order to preserve peace at home. But the tradition this book excavates is not based on realism or pragmatism. It is rooted, rather, in a sincere affinity. Its advocates avow, or at least intimate, that authoritarianism in one form or other is superior to democracy. They don't quite say that, even as they disparage liberals who invoke liberty and justice and history and democracy. Conservatives use the same terms as rhetorical cudgels. Their aim is to turn the language of liberalism on its head. They denounce cancel culture, but are busily canceling anything that nettles them, from books to beer. They define freedom as the ability to suppress the views and beliefs, ranging from transgender rights to an independent media, that they revile. At bottom, they are advocating ethno-nationalism in the guise of a set of principles, that the U.S. is the rare nation founded on universalist ideals, and that this has been the key difference between the U.S. and those foreign authoritarian nations they have long revered, scarcely seems to occur to them. This book does not argue that all conservatives are fascists, or that all fascists are conservatives, nor does it attempt to provide a comprehensive history of the American right. Instead, it provides a guide for the perplexed, identifying and tracing a persuasion, what might be called the illiberal imagination, that has persisted for over a century on the right. At the outset of the Cold War, George Orwell, in a classic essay in 1946 about the writings of James Burnham, a former Trotskyist who moved to the right, diagnosed the power worship in the intellectual class that prompted it to treat totalitarian societies as invincible and democratic ones as feeble. The intelligentsia, Orwell wrote, harbored a secret wish to usher in a hierarchical society where the intellectual can at last get his hands on the whip. In 1984, Orwell created just such a figure. For O'Brien, a member of the Inner Party who works at the Ministry of Truth, it is a source of sadistic satisfaction to wield terror as an instrument of purification, to torture Winston Smith, a minor functionary, into recanting his heresies and treating him as his savior. Neither the left nor the right has been immune to the power worship that Orwell discerned, perhaps because conservatives have often professed to hold something of a patent on patriotism. The illusions of the left about communist tyranny have tended to receive more attention than those of the right. The political pilgrims to communist countries have become a byword for human credulity or cynicism, but the right possesses its own tradition of homage to authoritarian regimes, masquerading as defenders of Western civilization. In examining the record of the latter,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?